This is Say It Loud. Buckle your seatbelts and get ready to immerse yourself in the complexities of our government. In 3, 2, 1, blast off.
Hi, this is Danush, and this is Speak It Loud, the podcast about free speech and the Bill of Rights. Today we're going to be discussing problems with the Sixth Amendment in the modern day. For example, public trials and social media. So, do any of you guys want to start? Talk about a specific case that piques your interest?
Yeah, I think it's important to discuss kind of the role of public trials historically in the United States. I think even going back to like the colonists and how often they weren't given this right to a fair trial because of like British colonization, and so that's why they found this really important to ensure that anyone who was like charged of a crime had this fair trial. And part of that was making sure that these criminal trials were public. And so I think we can discuss like about the role of like open trials.
Wait, but why do you think like public trials like necessarily protect the right to a fair trial? And historically, do you think this has been like an important role in protecting the right to a fair trial?
I think that inherently the concept behind an open trial is to prevent the government from infringing on the people's rights, so to make sure that the public can make sure that the government is, not secretly convicting people in sham trials as they did with the colonists. But now in the modern day, it's more so instead of against the government versus the people, open trials have become the people versus the media instead, where the media is coming into these trials and often spinning stories. So the problems of like the open trial has shifted throughout history.
Right, but also the point is like a lot of trials nowadays is not really like, yeah, it's public, but it's not like people are really going to them and like actually keeping the government accountable, right? So is it like really doing its job if no one's actually going to these trials other than like maybe family members?
But I don't think that's true because, I mean, even if no one's like going to these trials, it still doesn't change the fact that public trials serve as a check on the government. And two, like you have like more like high profile cases in which everyone's invested in those trials. But I do see your point that perhaps like the trials acting as a check on the government is only as good as like how like people make use of that, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with Leica, and I think kind of like the trial in everyone's minds right now, the biggest trial that's probably yet to come and it's currently in the jury selection process is the trial of Luigi Mangione, who is the alleged United Healthcare CEO shooter. And in large case public trials like this, where the government kind of has a vested interest in prosecuting this guy, but the people has a vested interest in making sure Luigi gets a fair trial. This is when like the features of an open trial come to like play, not in like like small town cases, things like that, but in the places big trials where the people care a lot and it seems to matter a lot.
But I think like focusing on like these major public trials kind of like isn't the point of the Sixth Amendment in itself. The point of the Sixth Amendment was to protect all common people from unfair convictions. So I don't think like focusing on these major trials does it justice, or we can say that the Sixth Amendment is doing a good job or doing a bad job by only focusing on these major trials where everyone is inherently invested.
But I think that like the idea of having an open trial inherently makes sure that, like the judges are making fair decisions, because there's always a possibility of facing repercussions from giving an unfair decision, where in the past this wasn't the case. They could give unfair decisions and not face any punishment. But just like the idea of open trials prevents this from happening like right now.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Maria, but then again, like the whole thing about, especially with developing media, and like I guess media invasiveness, it's like a double-edged sword in that even with Luigi's case, like you have so much like vested interest like of the public in like what happens to him, with many even like supporting him, but at the same time this extensive media coverage like with like the perp walk, for example, has actually probably like hindered and also impacted possibly his ability to get a fair trial or his privacy in that sense.
Although historically this media coverage could have served as a crucial check on the government, do you think that social media serves as the same positive check on the government as a form of media?
I would say probably not, in the sense that social media, because it's like user-generated content, you have like traditional media with like reputable or like credentialed journalists, etc., that have these like guidelines that they stick to ensure that the things that they're saying are true. And so I feel like that's probably closer to the check on the government compared to social media, where there's no such regulation
I feel like that's an oversimplification too, because traditional media, like newspapers, can be biased or whatnot. You can think back to World War II with yellow journalism. Just because it's a newspaper and has an editorial doesn't mean that it's going to be completely accurate. And I believe it's on the consumer to be able to fact check and verify that what they're reading is valid.
Yeah, I agree with Arsh's idea that newspapers should not necessarily be the only check of the people. As we move into the modern day, what is the point of having open trials? It's to have people be able to check the government. Social media now is kind of an encapsulation of the people's views, and by hindering the ability of social media to be able to interact with these trials and call like abuse of the government, which is basically how people interact and nowadays, would be to cut off the people from the trials essentially.
But I think going back to Ara's point about like sure, like it would be dangerous to have closed trials because I feel like this whole like free, like I mean, like the Sixth Amendment is built on this idea of protecting like right to a fair trial. But then at the same time now increasingly, it's the media has biased the people who are like being involved in these trials. For example, like judges and potential jurors. So what do we think about that?
So like I think the question you're saying is like how do we balance like the First Amendment right to like free speech and freedom of expression to like the Sixth Amendment's like right to like just the rights of the defendant. And honestly, I don't think it is like very easily like you can reconcile both ideas. Honestly, I think that the First Amendment inherently will create an environment where the defendant's right to a fair trial is not upheld, and as a result, I do believe that sometimes that the First Amendment should actually be like contained in a certain manner to protect the Sixth Amendment right.
Yeah, then this brings us to the Supreme Court's case, Nebraska Free Press Association, where the court actually ruled that that the prior restraint could not be practiced on newspaper and newspaper sources involving trials beforehand, whereas the courts cannot order newspapers to not publish information on the trial before the information has even gotten out. So would you say you agree with the practice prior restraint or agree with the court's decision in Nebraska?
And just to clarify Maria's point, in Nebraska Press Association v. Stewart 1976, they did uphold prior restraint in that case, but they did say that when there's no other alternative, then prior restraint is acceptable. And I think if we look at today's day and age, especially with social media and how everyone has access to the internet, I think that there is no other alternative. There is no other alternative to protecting the right to a fair trial other than giving prior restraint, because other measures are insufficient, as like people cannot completely eliminate the widespread effect of like social media on these trials.
I would kind of disagree in the sense that like looking at like the decision in Press Enterprise, the Superior Court in 1984, they said like people in a free democratic society cannot trust what they can't see, and I think that's a really strong ideal. That it's a very slippery slope that if you start like violating that, it's very easy for the government to exploit the people. And so yeah, I think that my personal opinion is that we should address this issue by changing like how trials are done, for example like in voir dire proceedings.
Wait, but like, okay, I like the point that you made, like, but I'd like to go back to R's point where I disagree with the use of prior restraint, because it's not practically impossible to like implement it. Because like considering especially the context of social media, are you supposed to like ban like everyone on TikTok from talking about the Luigi trial? That would be like large scale like mass censorship that would never be acceptable under the First Amendment. So the concept of prior restraint is just not really applicable.
Another like solution that people like talked about is like delaying trials itself to like so that like public expression, like obviously public expression is going to be heightened like directly after a criminal act occurs, but over time people will like kind of forget about the criminal act, and like news about this situation will eventually die down. So I think that delaying trials is actually a way that we can ensure that the right to a fair trial will continue to exist for defendants when all the news and media attention has died down.
But do you think that like delaying a trial would, like infringe on a person's right to a speedy trial?
No, because the right to a speedy trial is inherently on a burden on the government. So when a defendant waives that right in order to get a more fair trial, then the burden on the government has been lifted.
Do you guys think like though sometimes they're like, how do I say this, like the defendant won't waive the right to like a speedy trial though because like they want the press to be like prevalent at the time they're taking the trial? So is their right to a fair trial even like upheld?
Well, I think there are other ways to mitigate that, which goes back to Leica's amazing point on voir dire proceedings. Right now, where, for example, I talked about this before, but Luigi's trial is actually going through voir dire proceedings right now. And a lot of the press around Luigi hasn't died down yet enough to be kind of unbiased in the news sources. So right now they're looking for jurors for in Luigi's trials, and they've already dismissed a multitude of jurors related to the case because of potential biases from news sources. And that's one way to eliminate kind of the effects of long-lasting pervasive bias that media coverage has.
But a problem with voir dire is that there's no limit, because when at a certain point you can't dismiss everyone, and you saw this especially with the trial of Derek Chauvin, where they couldn't find people who didn't see the video of George Floyd getting killed. So then what do you do in that circumstance when voir dire fails?
I think the goal of voir dire should not be to find people who have never heard of information, because that's practically impossible, but rather the question should be will that information bias the way that you act in court? And so I think if someone can prove or be shown that they're not going to let that whatever they've consumed or the media that they've been exposed to affect their unbiased ability to act as a juror, then I don't see any reason why they should be removed.
Yeah, this exact mindset was propagated by Justice Marshall in the treason trial of Aaron Burr, where at that time there's virtually no one that had not heard of Aaron Burr's treason and the trial going with it, which resembles a lot of modern day trials would have with the widespread news that basically everyone has heard of these crimes. But Justice Marshall stated that it's okay if the juror has heard about this. It's simply that their mindset, that they're able to go in with an unbiased kind of point of view to be able to face the trial and make a fair decision.
I want to go back to a point that Arv made. He said that for the First Amendment, the Sixth Amendment should take precedence over the First Amendment. So you look to countries in Europe, such as the United Kingdom, who have the Contempt of Court Act, where they will openly use prior restraint over the loss of fair trial. Do you think that's justified? Should we adopt something similar?
I do think that I don't know if complete prior restraint is necessary, but I do think that to a certain extent some prior restraint should be in effect to stop the adverse effects that media outlets can create. And I think some prior restraint is necessary, particularly media outlets shouldn't be able to speculate about the defendant's guilt. They shouldn't be able to say, oh, this defendant's guilty, this defendant's not guilty, and they really shouldn't be stating the names and information of potential jurors that can even bias the right to a jury trial, a fair jury trial. So I do think that some prior restraint might be necessary to protect the right to protect the defendant's Sixth Amendment rights.
Okay, one issue I can see with that is that prior restraint isn't going to deal with the people's need to know or the media's desire to profit off of people's curiosity, such as for example yellow journalism, etc. And so I think even with prior restraint, that's going to increase the chance of more falsehoods being published just for media outlets to get money off of whatever's in the trial, because not all of them have this desire to publish whatever is correct. And so by restricting them, people are going to get worse, less reliable sources, because some people just want to make money.
Yeah, and then going back to Arjun's point, kind of on the contempt of court act specifically that they have in the United Kingdom, I think that it's impossible to implement in the United States because of the different cultural standards of how much each society values free speech compared to the United Kingdom, rest of Europe, and rest of the world. The United States values free speech so much more above. Where for example, that in United Kingdom they would never allow people to insult someone or things like that. The United States has very high bars to be able to limit free speech. That inherently means that a lot of these procedures, while seemingly helpful, can be implemented in the United States because of our value for the First Amendment.
Speaking of cultural differences or different approaches, I guess my next question would be is there something different for juvenile proceedings?
Yeah, and I think that inherently the juvenile system is a little bit different from the adult system, where the adult system is meant to punish people for the crimes that they have committed. The junior system is under the parentis patria philosophy, where the goal of the juvenile system is to rehabilitate the juvenile offenders and make them contributing members of the society again. And that inherently means that the juvenile court proceedings have different levels of scrutiny. For example, a lot of juvenile proceedings are closed to the public to protect the privacy of the juvenile, because the point is so they can reintegrate successfully back into the public instead of having their name and face all out there all the time, right?
Right, so it's not like their complete Sixth Amendment rights are not protected as being juveniles instead of adults, because, like, for example, they don't have a right to a jury trial. Usually it's a judge that makes a decision. But in the end of the day, I do believe that the jury trial, or the system for juvenile proceedings is actually beneficial, and honestly something that, like, a lot of people have thought about adopting for even the adult population, which is more of a rehabilitation instead of a punishment system.
Yeah, that's a great point, Arav. And I think a place we can see this occurring, kind of forming a rehabilitation mindset instead of a conviction mindset, is in kind of drug convictions, especially marijuana, where California and other states have legalized marijuana. In some states, marijuana is still punishable by the law, but California, for example, has kind of moved to the rehabilitative standpoint by legalizing marijuana, and in cases of drug offenses, have lowered punishments and instead of recommend treatments as the sentence instead of directly throwing people into jail, right?
Let's move on to technology in the courtroom. What are you guys' thoughts on technology having a place in the courtroom?
Yeah, so the first instance of technology in the courtroom to kind of become a major case is Estes v. Texas 1965, where the court ruled that cameras in the courtroom and television broadcasting did violate the right to a fair trial, inherently not even because of the news coverage is created, because the physical presence of the camera inherently might bias the judge and jurors, because they know that they're on public view. A lot of times superior court judges are publicly elected, so how they're perceived on camera can matter a lot to the election. And especially jurors who are members of the community, they care a lot how they're perceived by their peers. And so that's why the court ruled that cameras should not be allowed in the courtroom.
However, this was overruled in Chandler v. Florida 1981, where the court ruled that the presence of cameras in the courtroom does not inherently violate a defendant's right to a fair trial. However, it did make the stipulation that judges can impose limitations and restrictions on specific cases based on the circumstances.
Yeah, but we still see today kind of the importance that not having cameras have in the courtrooms, where many state court systems have moved to having cameras in their courtrooms. Federal courts, especially the Supreme Court, don't have any cameras in their courtrooms, only audio recordings. And while the philosophy behind that now in the modern age, when many state courts have evolved to cameras and stuff, is simply tradition, the idea behind it still stands. The federal courts don't have cameras, and that in a sense can be seen as kind of a balance between Sixth Amendment and free speech.
But for those who support cameras in the courtroom, why should there be a difference between federal courts and district courts itself? What's the inherent difference between a federal court, for example, the Supreme Court, there's no cameras allowed, and district courts cases, or even just state court cases where cameras are allowed? Why is there a difference between the two divisions of the judicial branch?
I don't think there's a legal difference in the sense. I think it's more like Maria stated, cultural precedent and kind of the different roles that, for example, the Supreme Court holds in American society is very different from a superior court, for example. And so I think because of that, it's one on the states as well, for state courts to decide that, and then also to because of past precedent, and this is generally how the system has been. And so yeah.
Right, but the point is if you do believe, or if you don't believe that cameras are affecting the defendant's right to a fair trial, then why shouldn't it be allowed in the highest court of the land? Why should it be allowed in the highest court of the land?
Well, I don't think that it shouldn't be allowed, but rather that if you think about it, the court is, for lack of a better word, archaic, I guess, and slower to change. And so I think that a change like that would take longer to be implemented and would require support from for example, the justices. And so I don't think it's a matter of should or shouldn't, but whether if people are receptive to it or not. I
guess one way you can argue this is also a lot of the court cases on the federal level aren't criminal court cases, and the Sixth Amendment only does apply to federal proceedings, and there are a lot of them are appellate court cases. So that's an argument that you can make, definitely.
So what do you guys think are some ways that courts can mitigate these things?
One way that judges can ensure that a fair trial is upheld is through change of venue. For example, I don't remember the case, but there was the murders at Idaho, and since it was such a local shock to the community there, they requested a change of venue because everyone in that area would be biased, and the judge thought that it would be a more fair trial if they moved the trial to a place where there wasn't as much local media coverage on the issue.
But I think the problem with change of venue, is that so the point of change of venue is that you go to an area that has less media attention and there's less publicity with the case, so that the right to a fair trial is better protected. But in today's social media age, sometimes there are some cases where it doesn't matter where you change the venue to, what district you change it to, it's still going to be a huge social media presence there no matter what, because the information is spread all around the country. So I don't know if change of venue itself is going to help or is going to protect the right of a fair trial to a lot of major profile cases.
So I think that kind of sums up generally this issue of the First Amendment versus Sixth Amendment, and that there's a lot of debate and different people have different perspectives based on what they value as to which should be prioritized more. I think generally in American society you can see that there's definitely we tend to protect our freedom of speech over other freedoms, but at the same time I do think we need to think closer about how changing media can really affect a defendant's right to get a fair trial that in the past might not have been an issue necessarily.
Thanks for listening. That was Say It Loud with Arav, Maria, Leka, Arkith, and Danush.